Remembering the good and the bad, the moments filled with joy and the ones filled with woe. Remembering the times when we're at our best and the times when we could have been better. When a loving rebuke from a loved one might have pulled us back to the place we should have been. Recounting the events that led us to where we are, telling the stories of where we've been and of what we've seen, telling the stories of who did what for whom, and unfortunately we can't escape recounting the stories of who did what to whom. Our moments of recounting and remembering come in an even-handed way, even when we're forced to remember that we were the ones who did something that we'd just as soon forget. We recount and remember for those around us too, sometimes at a gravesite, sometimes at our kitchen tables, sometimes over our kids' objections that the story doesn't need repeating again. But even with all the objections, even with the reminder from Cheryl that she's heard the story many times before, even with the reminder of things that bring such pain that recalling is something we should sidestep, we recount and remember. In this week's Parashat Devarim, before the children of Israel, Moses recounts the events of their 40 years in the desert, rebuking them for their shortcomings and instructing them to keep the Torah and observe the commandments. Moses recounts his appointment of judges to ease his own burden. He recounts the story of the spies and the conquests of the Amorites and Bashanites. Moses remembers the refusal of the nations of Moab and Ammon to allow the children of Israel to pass through their lands. Moses recounts his message to Joshua, who as Moses' successor would lead the Israelite tribes. Moses recounts at length to those assembled before him all that had happened, both good and bad, so the Israelites would not forget. Moses recounts and remembers, hoping that all would remember, remembering even the times when the Israelites were the ones who did something that they'd just as soon forget. Moses knew, and we know, that we humans are unique in the ability to recount and remember. Not reflexive memory, like where the food bowl is, or how the batted ball is going to feel when it hits the shin, but thoughtful, intentional memory that serves a purpose. Moses recounts the story of the 40 years for instruction, but we recount and remember for other reasons. Sometimes we remember something with longing, for when times were better, or outcomes were better, or perhaps when test results were better. But in this case, it's always remembering and wishing for what was, and maybe trying just a little to forget what is. At times, our remembering is an attempt to get a picture of what might happen in the future, an acknowledgement that history can repeat itself, and to be prepared if whatever happened happens again, to gird ourselves for what the future might drop on our plates. Sometimes we remember because it's comfortable. The past, with its full dose of pleasures and hardships, is predictable. We know how the story ends. We know where the joys and the sorrows were in the minefield that we've already crossed, as opposed to the unknowable future where we can never truly be certain where we can safely step. And a fourth reason to remember, one that I learned about only in group bereavement counseling when my sister died 16 years ago. We remember to try, even in our unconscious minds, to correct the past's injustices and losses, to remember, to take the figuratively separated parts of an organized whole and put them back together, to somehow undo the unthinkable losses, even when the putting back together exists only in our unconsciousness. We do it all the time with the hope that this time the outcome will be different. And we remember so as to recognize the wholeness of our past, this time in our fully conscious minds, so that those we lost remain part of us, with their values, their outlooks, their senses of humor, or whatever it is that we carry with us until the end of our time. But Moses is remembering and recounting for yet another reason. He is 37 days from dying, and he's telling of the past to give context to those in front of him. Not to recall better times, they certainly were not. Not to predict what might happen in the future. Not to find comfort in the known in the face of the unknowable. Not to hope for a different outcome, even unconsciously. The pursuit of context is a human one. We long to understand why. The generation in front of Moses is not the same generation that started the trek. This generation needs context to move forward, to understand the why in everything that is to happen, to fully understand the hardships of their forebears, and to have the understanding foster a deep sense of compassion. So here we are, remembering our times, recounting and remembering for those around us, and even for ourselves, where we've been, giving context for what lies ahead as we struggle to understand why, sometimes at a gravesite, sometimes at our kitchen table. May we be granted the ability to remember what was, and sometimes to forget, just a little, what we'd just as soon forget, and to move ahead with meaning and compassion after our own 40 years in the desert.